Fate. Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 16-18. Chapter 16. The attack begins. How are things looking out there, Roman? Ritska asked as they crested the ridge and got a good look at their target. Orleans. As expected. Roman frowned. It's swarming with wyverns. I can see them. Ash pointed to the clouds of lizards swarming around in the sky above the main fortress in the center of the city. They'll likely detect our presence soon. In that case, I suggest we hurry them along. Georgios announced as he marched forwards. Are you prepared, caster? He cast a brief glance over his shoulder at Amadeus. The musician shrugged his shoulders. I doubt you can ever be ready for something like this. He gestured to the sky full of fire-breathing reptiles, before a carefree smile worked its way onto his face. But I'll play my part and conduct a special symphony for this event. Even in this situation, you're still obsessed with music? Marie sighed and shook her head. Be careful out there, musical pervert. I should be saying that to you, he muttered as he and Georgios walked ahead of the group. Myself and Master will split off from you when we locate Fafnir, Siegfried said to the group. They nodded in affirmative. The Dragon Witch will likely be with him. I shall accompany you, Jean announced as she stood next to the tall knight. Kiyohime and Mash took their place next to Ritska, the former standing far too close for his comfort. Let's move, guys, Ritska announced and thrust his fist into the air. Operation Dragonslayer is a go. Operation Dragonslayer? Siegfried mouthed in confusion as he turned to Mash. The girl looked as surprised as he did by the announcement. At the curious looks he got, Ritska held up his hands. What? I thought we should name our attack, and Operation Dragonslayer sounded like as good a name as any. I like it, Roman pointed out. Get straight to the point. It's tacky and embarrassing. Olga shut him down. Please refrain from naming our future operations in such a base manner. Perhaps we should return to the task at hand, Ash interjected. Whatever we may call our offensive is hardly relevant to our current situation. He waited for a few moments before slowly nodding his head. However, it is a very fitting name. Thanks, guys. Ritska sniffed slightly, then turned his gaze back to Orleans. Let's go then. Charge. The servants then all began sprinting downhill and broke off into different directions. Farum Pav, the nameless king, raised a single eyebrow in a questioning manner as he watched the enemy forces break off into a seemingly mad sprint towards them. He knew their options were limited considering that the Chevalier, as them, was called, had already alerted his summoner to their positions in the early morning. He was expecting a frontal assault, but this seemed to be more akin to a mad dash across the battlefield. Marie. The rider looked to his left to see the mad executioner with an ecstatic glee in his eyes as his gaze honed in on someone within the battlefield. Farum looked and soon spotted a small pale girl riding a crystal horse mowing down undead by the dozen as she streaked across the battlefield. Marie. Ryder watched as the assassin launched himself from the walls and began his own mad sprint in her direction. Ryder changed his outlook on the battlefield now. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the enemy servants and their positions. After a few moments he allowed himself a sly smirk. It seems that the enemy master was far more shrewd than he had given him credit for. The mad dash had broken into multiple assaults along their front line, with most of their forces focused on protecting the Dragon Slayer and the Master of Humanity. He looked and noticed the servants on the opposite side of the battlefield seemed to be attracting a majority of the wyverns to them and away from the human. She's here. Farum withheld a snarl as the Dragon Witch came up next to him, the woman scowling as she glared at the battlefield. That stupid little farm girl, she muttered hatefully, then sent a small look at Farum. Head out and meet them. I'm sending the other servants to face them as well. She gave a hateful smile. If they want to die so readily, I see no reason to deny them. Farum gave her a grunt of acknowledgement as he leapt from the walls, Storm summoning itself beneath him and taking them both into the air, and changed directions to head straight for the Dragon Slayer and the human master. He would rather not have gone for them immediately, however the accursed command seal compelled him to seek out the greatest threat to his summoner's life, which unfortunately was the knight and the human boy. He snarled in frustration as he approached the group. Master Group Pav. You've got incoming, Roman shouted over the chaos of the battlefield. Looks like the enemy rider. Rider. Ritska sent a mental command. Their rider is approaching us. Get yourself and Sigward ready to intercept him. He looked back to the sky as saw the four-winged bird-like dragon come to a stop above the group. The rider hovered in front of them before calling down, "I see your wounds have healed, Dragon Slayer." It was an observation rather than a taunt. Siegfried nodded his head at the rider. "The curses which afflicted my body upon our last meeting are no longer an issue." "Curses?" Rider parroted, seemingly confused. "What do you mean? Why would you be?" He cut himself off. His whole body began to tremble with rage at something. "That infernal woman." He all but snarled the word out hatefully. "She insults me yet again." His head snapped back to the group. "In that case, your survival pleases me greatly. I would consider it a great insult to my honor if my opponent was killed by a poisoning." "You seem to hold great disdain for the Dragon Witch." Jean called out to the rider. "If that is the case, why do you follow her?" "She is my summoner." Rider answered. Despite my reservations, it amazed Ritska how the servant could make the word sound so insulting. Towards her, she still called me forth. However, she has dealt a great insult one too many times. Then why not stand aside? She has me bound by a command seal. He answered back immediately. "I am currently restraining myself from killing you as best I can as we speak." However, his voice took a more subdued tone. "If you were to provide me a more present threat, I would be inclined to pursue them rather than you." "Good thing I'm here then," was the cry of Astolfo that echoed out. Rider's head snapped to the shout, only for his dragon to let out a cry of shock and pain as it took a bolt of lightning to the face and flail through the air slightly. "What?" Farum let out a cry of alarm as the hippogriff rider shot past him. Time seemed to slow as both he and Sigward made eye contact with the enemy rider for the briefest of moments before they shot off and into the sky. Storm reoriented itself, growling slightly at the new burn mark on its beak. Farum watched the hippogriff circle through the air as it made to return to attack him. Farum looked down at the group again and chuckled. "I believe this shall suffice." With that he let out a command and his dragon immediately let out a roar as it charged the smaller mount. "Let us make haste." Siegfried spoke. "We still have yet to locate Fafnir." "That rider," Mash mused. "He didn't seem a bad person." "He is the leader of Ash's Covenant." Ritska shrugged his shoulders. "He's a little intense, but I can't say I hate him. I suppose he's been one of our biggest allies in this singularity." "Quite so." Jean nodded an affirmative. "Unexpected," she muttered, then narrowed her eyes ahead of the group. "We should steel ourselves master. It seems we have wyverns approaching. Guess St. Georgios and Mozart can't distract them all." Ritska lamented, then looked to his right. "Berserker? I don't suppose you'd be willing to demonstrate a true dragon, would you?" The girl smiled at Ritska. "Of course, Master Sama." Ashpav the saber servant released a small grunt of exertion as he swung his sword downwards and split a wyvern in half. His grip on the blade changes and he slashed at his side while releasing a burst of black flame. The undead which had been attempting to flank him were caught up in the fire and released wails as the black fire consumed them, leaving behind only charred remains. Ash nodded to himself as he surveyed his work. A roar took his attention to the sky just in time to see the pink-haired rider's mount shoot through the air, swiftly followed by the much larger dragon mount that the nameless king rode upon. Ash bit his lip behind his helm. The discovery of the identity of the rider still plagued his mind. However, he would have to place his concerns at the back of his mind. The battlefield was no place for distractions. "Arg!" Ash heard the cry and instincts gained over hundreds of fights took over as he flung himself to the side. The wyvern which had been in front of him was less fortunate as the distinctive blur of gale smashed into the hapless beast and completely obliterated it, sending chunks of scale and meat in every direction. Ash rolled away and then sprang back to his feet. He gripped his blade with two hands as Gale slowly stood up from his crouched position and turned on him. He cursed his luck. In single combat, he wouldn't fancy his chances against the slave knight, and he wasn't afforded that luxury. While the wyverns themselves were no considerable threat to him, they would provide a distraction. Which in this situation would mean his death. "Oh!" The shout was followed by a blue-shaped blur striking the side of Gale's head. Ash blinked in surprise as Cu quite literally jump-kicked the knight in the head and sent him tumbling away. "You better go find Lancer, pal," Cu said as he twirled his spear and assumed a stance. "I'll handle this guy." A feral grin worked his way onto Cu's face as Gale rose to his feet. "I wish you luck then." Ash nodded his head at CU and turned away and continued to hack through the wyverns. Assassin Pav Sasaki Kojira would, for the first time since his summoning, admit he was having more fun than he really should have been having. This swordsman. Swordswoman. This swordsperson was certainly skilled, it was just a shame they were under the affliction of a madness enhancement. He diverted the strike, aimed at taking his head, to the left so it overshot him. His Nodashi thrust forwards, his assailant leaning their neck to the left so he was barely able to cut them. It is most unfortunate we could not face each other when your skills were not hampered by such an unsightly display. Sasaki spoke. The saber servant rushed forwards and delivered multiple thrusts as the assassin. Sasaki would admit, this one would be stronger than him even without the madness enhancement. However, he still had the edge in speed. Diverting and parrying their strikes was a challenging feat, but it was more practical than trying to use his sword like some kind of club. My blade may be lending its aid to evil. Saber countered, her eyes narrowing, but it remains as pure as ever. So I see. Sasaki smiled as they locked blades. Saber could easily blow him back, however they seemed to repress their madness for a few moments. I am Chevalier Dian. They announced. Sasaki nodded his head and kicked away from them as they broke the engagement and attempted to slash him. In that case, I am Sasaki Kojira. Assassin class servant. He nodded his head. For a brief moment a flicker of a smile appeared on Saber's face. Fitting that I face an assassin such as yourself. They nodded before their expression steeled. Perhaps it is a killer of men that is needed to end this nightmare. They pointed their rapier at Kojira. Fight me with your full strength, Sasaki, or you shall die. If you insist. He darted forwards. From Saber's perspective he seemed to disappear and then reappear in front of them. Their eyes widened and their rapier swung downwards as the Nodashi swung up. A spurt of blood impacted the ground. My, Sasaki chuckled. That was rather close, he said as he examined the cut through his sleeve, blood already beginning to drip from the slash across his arm. You are a better saber than an assassin. Dian spoke as they turned around, a cut just above her eye, blocking out half their vision. Had I not been able to strike at the last moment, you would have taken my head. I suppose I shall have to settle for an eye. He smiled to steeled his expression. I doubted it would be that easy, however. Although I suppose you have shown, even in your maddened state, that Western swordplay is more than simply flailing about. Dian merely frowned as they readied themselves again. Now let us continue, Saber. Sasaki said, getting into a stance of his own. Let us see if I may yet end this nightmare of yours. Sigward and Astolfo Pav. You ever have one of those moments where you think something sounds like a good idea so you do it, only to realize how badly it actually is? Astolfo idly asked as they were chased through the air by the Stormdrake. Yes. Sigward admitted, throwing another bolt of lighting at their pursuer. I have had moments such as those. Good, Astolfo nodded, worried I was alone for a second. Nonsense. Sigward waved him off. This is likely one such dodge. He let out a cry. Astolfo heeded his advice and their hippogriff darted to the left. Seconds later a gigantic bolt of lightning went shooting past where they had last been. Yikes. Astolfo let out a cry as they stared to zigzag through the air to avoid the torrent of lightning bolts that the enemy rider was throwing at them. Sigward frowned behind his helm. They needed to separate the two or put Ryder in a position where he would be unable to use his dragon mount effectively. His eyes widened in realization. He had an idea. A very stupid idea, he would admit, but an idea nonetheless. He turned back to Astolfo. Ryder. I have a plan. Oh. Let's hear it. Cu Chalain Pav Lancer slid underneath the overarching strike Gale hand launched underneath him, the blade impacting the dirt just behind his head. Lancer's face morphed into a feral grin and he spun around and lashed out with his spear. The red lance pierced straight through the armor behind Gale's knee and out the other side. The giant released a cry of pain and collapsed onto the ground, his sword now working as a crutch. Cu ripped his spear clean from the leg and spun it around, ready to drive it through the berserker's head. He was forced to change his attack into a defense when the berserker spun around on his good leg and gave a horizontal slash towards him. Lancer grit his teeth as the spear blocked the strike, albeit barely, and his legs buckled. Thrusting the spear downwards, Cu used his to smack himself away from the giant servant. His opponent gone. Gale lost his balance and haphazardly crashed to the ground. Cu narrowed his eyes. The berserker had taken him by surprise in their first encounter, although now he was fully prepared for whatever tricks. Whatever thoughts he had were suddenly dashed and his eyes widened in alarm. Gale suddenly threw himself into the air and then thrust his sword forwards. The momentum of the strike sending the berserker rocketing towards Lancer like an arrow. Shit! Cu barely had time to cry out a curse before he threw himself away from the berserker in order to avoid the mad servant. The ground exploded in clumps of dirt as the berserker smashed into the ground where Lancer had been. Still midair, Lancer had no room to maneuver when several bright discs of energy were flung at him. Awkwardly twisting his body, Lancer was able to avoid two of the three. The third slashed itself across his shoulder. He bit back a grunt of pain as the disc burnt through his skin and left a burnt slash through his shoulder. Having heard what happened to Ruler, Lancer immediately darted away from where the discs were the second his feet touched the ground. The discs hovering in the air before returning back to Gale. The red servant climbed out of the hole like a beast on all fours, dragging his useless leg behind him as the hood focused itself on Lancer. Damn. Cu rolled his injured shoulder and winced. Saber wasn't kidding. You are a real piece of work. He smirked. But we gotta fight to finish, old man. The smirk became a bloodthirsty grin. So try not to die too quickly. Both he and Gale launched at each other. The flurry of blade meeting spear was barely readable as a blur of movement and a chaotic clash of metal. Gale, lacking mobility due to his injured limb, was forced to lash out from the ground, crawling around on all fours and wildly hurling his blade at Lancer. Cu was no fool, however. He could see that even if it appeared to be wild slashes, the berserker was demonstrating a rather advanced level of skill. Berserker roared and gripped his blade with two hands. Using his good leg he launched himself into the sky and pointed the blade downwards. Lancer kicked back as the giant smashed into the ground. Gale wasted no time in ripping his sword upwards in a vertical slash which sent a cloud of debris towards Lancer. Cu squinted his eyes as the dirt engulfed his vision. He swung his lance to clear away the dust, then widened them in alarm as a storm of crossbow bolts emerged from the cloud and headed straight for him. He spun his spear and deflected a good portion of them, however two of them impacted his side. He grunted and narrowed his eyes. Protection from arrows only worked as he could see his opponent. He gave a pained smirk. Seemed that the old man was capable of learning some new tricks after all. He reached up and pulled the bolt from his shoulder and tossed it away before doing the same to the one embedded in his side. He looked back to Berserker. The red-caped giant stared at him as the dust began to settle. Crossbow still in hand. The Berserker then looked down to the weapon before dismissing it. He gradually rose to his feet, using his sword to balance himself on. Lancer narrowed his eyes and assumed a stance, ready to charge or jump away at a moment's notice. Seconds later, wisps of red fire began to leap from the old mont's armor and cape. Lancer widened his eyes and grinned. Noble phantasm. He got no reply, but he didn't need one. The amount of power that the old man was building up was enough of an answer. In that case, only fitting I answer in kind. His expression hardened. His spear tip pointed towards the ground suddenly burst into life with bright red energy. Berserker's armor burst into flames and launched over a dozen burning orbs into the sky, the red flames sailing towards Lancer as he charged forwards. "I'll have your heart," Cu cried out as he closed the distance between himself and Berserker in a moment, the spear thrust towards the ground. Guy Bolg. Ashpav the undead swordsman continued to slash his way through the field of wyverns. He needed to find the enemy Lancer before they found his master. His left arm lashed out and gripped the snout of a wyvern, the pyromancy incinerating the skull instantly before returning his grip to his blade and swinging it sideways, cutting off the head of another of the flying beasts. This was taking far too long. He held his sword out in front of him, placing his palm on the blade. "This sword is the dark soul of man," he intoned, running it across the blade and causing it to burst into life with black fire. "The flames of humanity shall clear all away." He drew the blade under his left arm and lashed outwards. Elfried. A wave of fire followed, immolating the surrounding wyverns and leaving the ashen one standing in a burnt circle in the field. Satisfied he had dealt the immediate threat, he turned to survey the surrounding His eyes widened in alarm as he saw the sky burst to life with green energy before it broke into lines that began shooting down the center of the field. Master! Ash cried in alarm. The enemy archer had come out and gone straight for his master's group in the center of the field. He sprinted towards that direction, only to slide to a halt and hold up his sword to block a strike aimed at him. He grit his teeth as the impact of a spear against his sword sent him skidding backwards slightly. He lowered the blade and turned his attention to the man standing in front of him. The man in a black royal long coat, pale skin and long platinum blonde hair stared back at him with thinly veiled disgust. A feeling which Ash made no attempt to hide, as every instinct in his gut was telling him that this man had more in common with a creature of Lothric than a human. "What manner of abomination are you?" Ash snarled at the man, his left hand beginning to glow with a pyromancy. The man scoffed and narrowed his eyes at the saber servant. "That would be my question. You and the odd night reek of death." His nose shriveled as he had smelt something foul. A disgusting mix of a funeral pyre and a grave, rotting in age. "What manner of dark sorcery ripped you from your grave? What manner of inhuman power granted you this?" Ash gestured to him. "You wear the form of a man like a thin cloak, you fool no one." "TCH. The man clicked his tongue. "I had planned to find the Holy Maiden, but I shall deal with your impudence first and use her blood to wash away the stink of your existence. I shall do this world a similar courtesy," Ash muttered darkly as he raised his sword, "and rid it of whatever manner of perverse creature you are." Nameless King Pav, he hurled another bolt of sunlight at the fleeing pair. While the beast he was chasing was no match for Storm's might, he would admit that it had his Drake beat in terms of pure speed. However, their speed meant nothing if they could not defend themselves properly. The Katarinen had the right idea in targeting Storm, however it would take far more than whatever sunlight bolts he could cast to bring down his mount. He narrowed his eyes as the flying half-breed suddenly lurched upwards and shot into the air, heading upwards. "Follow," he commanded. Storm obeyed and shot off after them. He lost sight of them when the creature disappeared into the clouds. He paid it no mind though. He would soon have them within his sights again. They could no flee from him forever. If anything, he found it somewhat unfortunate he could not fight the Katarinen on an open field. Even in his exile, he had heard stories of the prowess of the Onion Knights of Katarina. To see one was certainly a surprise. However, his command seal forced him to forego attempts at fair combat and chase them down with his complete arsenal. Storm cleared the cloud layer. Tally-ho! Farum widened his eyes in alarm as the second they breached the clouds, the onion-shaped armor of the knight was rocketing towards him. Ryder barely had the time to process what was happening before the knight tackled him with the force of a battering ram. Farum released a cough as the wind was blown out of him and both he and the knight were sent flying off of the back of the drake and into a free fall. Farum couldn't even exclaim surprise before the knight struck him in the face with a haymaker. Ryder's head snapped to the side in surprise and shock at the punch. It didn't last long before he reacted with a punch of his own which launched the knight away from him. Sigward cartwheeled through the air before attempting to right himself as best he could, only to be tackled by Ryder as he launched himself at the knight. From an outside perspective, the viewer would have been treated to the bizarre sight of the two engaging in an awkward brawl as they fell through the sky, rapidly heading towards the ground. Farum was internally laughing at the sheer audacity of the knight. He would never have expected anything like this. He sent a mental command to Storm to continue pursuing the enemy rider. He was confident he could kill the Katarinen himself. His dragon could keep the other servant occupied. His thoughts were cut short when he took a boot to the face which caused him to perform several backflips through the air. When he finally stopped spinning, both himself and the knight were staring at each other as they continued their free fall. "You are quite possibly insane, Katarinen," Farum barked out a laugh. "I am inclined to agree with you," the knight replied as he looked down, barely 100 meters from the ground. "Good. I was hoping for a fight like T." He was cut off when the pair impacted the ground in a deafening explosion of debris. We're at the finale of the first Singularity. Also, had a few comments talking about how I've underpowered the Ashen One. I think I got him pretty well. In game, you're not exactly blessed with overwhelming strength, speed and durability. The whole point is you're just some guy. No, like the heroes of old, the whole point of being an Ashen One is that you were ultimately worthless, not fit to be fuel for the first flame. So I think giving him C+ strength, which means in certain situations he can exceed a rank, is actually pretty representative of his skills. Also, seriously, were you expecting him to just bat away every servant like they were nothing? You know how boring it is to just have an OP main character and just have them blitz their way through every single fight. It gets old, really quickly. Also, to give you an idea, these are the stats of Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, whom I would consider to be a top-class servant. In-game, basically a 4-star servant, Esser Ornstein. Servant. Lancer Strength. B+ Endurance. B+ Agility, A+. Mana. B Luck. E Noble Phantasm. A Dragon Slayer Spear Rank, A. Fulgur Principe. A releases a single bolt of lightning, anti-unit. Max target 0 to 1, max range 0 to 20. Class Skills Divinity. C Magic Resistance. C Personal Skills. Knight Captain of Gwyn. X. Extensive knowledge of the miracles, rank A, of Gwyn and high charisma from leading his personal knights. Can apply A+ to any of his skills, save luck and mana. Blessing of Gwyn. A. High resistance to fire and lightning-based attacks. Leo Ring. A+, apply A+ modifier to his Strength Dragonslayer. A++. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 17. Duel's Ritska peeked his head out from behind Mash as her noble phantasm began to dissipate. He let out a sigh as he saw the carnage which had been wrought upon the surrounding area as a result of the enemy attack. He swallowed, I take it that was Archer. Indeed. Siegfried frowned. They had seen the sky light up and Mash had instantly darted in front of the group and thrown up her shield to protect them. I knew they were under madness enhancement. But to act this brazenly, he turned to Ritska and bowed his head. Sorry, this was an outcome I could not foresee. It's fine. Ritska waved his hands as he addressed the knight. It's not like any of us knew their Archer was going to do that. He speaks truly, Jean spoke as she walked past them, then lowered her flag so the tip was pointing ahead of them. It seems as though Archer has come to face us herself. The group turned to where she was pointing, only to see a figure stride forwards across the battlefield. A rabid and crazed look in her eye as she twitched, likely a result of her madness enhancement. Animal ears shot up in alert as she drew back her bow. Kill you, she growled out, I'll kill you. I'll kill you. Then, she let loose a barrage of arrows. Mash widened her eyes and raised her shield, digging herself into the ground as the impact of over a dozen arrows in rapid succession registered on her shield. Saber. Ruler. Ritska called out, flank her, Mash, provide cover for us. He turned to Kiyohime. Could you give us a smokescreen of fire? Of course, Master Sama. The teal-haired girl smiled and waved her fan in front of her face before stealing her expression. Go! Ritska cried out. Kiyohime stepped in front of him at the same time Mash raised her shield. Archer raised her bow to fire, only to wince and jump away when Kiyohime released a torrent of flames in her direction. The archer released a snarl of annoyance at the attack as she readied her bow to fire through the flames. She then widened her eyes as she caught sight of the shine of metal in sunlight. Her eyes darted to her side just in time to see both Siegfried and Jean rushing at her from opposite directions. Whatever plan she made to avoid them was cut short when Kiyohime struck her in the chest with several balls of fire. Archer choked out a breath as she was forced back, eyes widening in pain at the burns. She raised her head just in time to see Balmung slicing through the air towards her neck while Jean rushed her back with the tip of her standard. Ritska grimaced as Archer's head was separated from her body and Jean ran her through. The headless corpse slumped over. The only thing stopping it from falling to the ground was the face it was being held up by Jean's standard. Enemy defeated, Master. Mash announced as the body began to fade into motes of light. Why yeah. Ritska looked away from the corpse, face still scrunched up as he took in a deep breath. Sorry. Not quite used to seeing that yet. Senpei. Mash went to rub his back when Kiyohime swatted her hand away with her fan. Mash began, only to receive a glare from the dragon girl. Keep your hands away from my Anshin Sama, harlot, she hissed out. Mash's eyes widened in surprise at the insult and implication. Harlot. Whatever she was going to say in rebuttal was cut off when a massive explosion registered to the group. They all turned in surprise to see a giant mushroom cloud of dust kicked up into the sky. Rider calling all servants. The pink-haired boy's voice echoed through their mind. Ooh, I can do this now? Awesome. Anyway, Onion Dude is currently fighting not evil but not good God Rider at the moment. Also, I'm still being chased by a dragon. Wait, was that the explosion just now? Ritsuka asked in alarm. He received a crazed laugh in response. Yep. He literally jumped off Hippo-kun and just tackled the guy off his dragon in midair. Best plan I ever saw. Or the worst. But hey, it worked, right? Ash, how are you coming along with finding Lancer? Ritsuka asked next. Found him. Talk later, was the only reply he received. Sasa. Found Saber. Talk later. Another swift reply. Ritsuka blinked and shrugged at the group. Guess everything is going according to plan so far. He sighed. Hope it stays that way. He clapped his hands. Let's go find us a dragon to kill. You sound like Sigward, senpai. Mash pointed out, which made him blink then look thoughtful. Is he rubbing off on me? He idly wondered then shook his head. Doesn't matter, let's go find Fafnir. Yes, master. Siegfried replied. Marie threw up a small barrier of crystals as Sanson swung his claymore at her. The metal blade striking the makeshift shield and shattering off portions of it before stopping. The white-haired man teased in annoyance before pulling his sword back and punching through the barrier. Ordinarily, his strength wouldn't have allowed this. One of the few things he was thankful for when it came to the madness enhancement. Marie widened her eyes in surprise as her barrier was smashed to pieces as the assassin followed in the wake of the destruction. Sanson slashed downwards as he leapt at her, Marie darting to the side as the blade impacted the dirt where she had stood. Sanson shifted his grip on his claymore and slashed upwards towards Marie's direction. The pale-skinned woman ducked underneath the slash as it separated several long strands of hair from her head. Sanson bodily throwing himself into the strike left his chest open. However, Marie held out her palm and instantly cast a bright pink orb of mana which struck him dead center. Sanson released a snarl of pain as he was blasted off his feet and into a roll away from her. Righting himself after a few meters, he came to a stop and leveled a glare at Marie, although from her perspective he seemed to be angrier at himself than anything else. Why? He muttered to himself as he charged Marie again. His movements were erratic and desperate. Marie threw up another makeshift crystal shield to block his strike and retaliated with a shard to his knee. Sanson let out a cry of pain as the shard buried itself in his leg. Pushing past his pain, he slashed across the shield with as much might as he could muster into his being. The shield shattered, yet Marie had already jumped out of his range by the time. His sword slicing through empty air yet again. Why? Sanson let out another cry of irritation. Why can't I hit you? He ran at her, his strike barely skimming past her neck. Why, I've killed so many since that day. I've become a much stronger executioner. So why? His eyes were wide at this point, desperation and anguish leaking from them as he failed to land a hit on Marie. The woman, for her part, took his face in with sympathetic note. Oh Sanson, she spoke for the first time. He paused as she spoke. How sad. I should have told you when we reunited. What? Sanson blinked at her in confusion. Our relationship ended that day. She gave a sorrowful expression. You can't defeat me, because your blade has rusted. Rusted? He parroted in confusion. I don't. You've killed so many. You increased your proficiency as a killer. Marie agreed. But a killer and an executioner are two different things. The more skilled you became at killing, the rustier your blade became. At this point, you are no longer a savior of criminals. Sanson just stared at her wide-eyed, his shoulders dropping. It's sad. By the time you followed the Dragon Witch, you were no longer the Sanson I knew. No. Lies. Sanson snarled at her, his face frenzied. It cannot be. I kept my faith that you would eventually come here. I shall show you how skilled I've become. He slammed his claymore into the ground as the air behind him shimmered, a gargantuan guillotine manifesting itself behind the executioner. I shall give you the perfect execution. That ecstasy before death. A beheading you truly deserve. He ripped his sword free and pointed it at her. La mort espoir. Ghostly hands immediately rushed from underneath the giant blade and towards Marie. The woman sighed and shook her head. In that case, dear Sanson, I shall have to show you. Her face shifted into a determined one as she cast her crystal horse into existence and leapt atop it, the mount rushing through the air as it avoided the hands. Marie stared back at Sanson on the ground as he stared back at her. She closed her eyes and released a breath as the horse galloped through the air, turning towards his direction. Her eyes snapped open and she released a shout, "Guillotine breaker!" The horse instantly charged the executioner. Sanson's eyes went wide in alarm as the second the mount hit the ground it released a wave of glass spikes protruding upwards. Marie charged forwards towards Sanson. The assassin met her own defiant look with one of his own as Marie closed in on him, the hands overshooting the horse as she was scant meters from Sanson. He gripped his blade with two hands as he swung upwards at her. Far too late to avoid the attack as she smashed through his side, obliterating the left half of his body. Sanson released barely a cry of pain as she shot past him, his blade knocked from his hand and the guillotine fading from existence. Sanson dropped to his knees, eyes wide in disbelief. The only thing stopping him from slumping over to the ground was Marie catching him in a hug. "WWH. He stuttered out before releasing a bloodied cough. My blade was far too rusty, in the end. I told you," she whispered as she held him close, stroking the back of his head. Sanson released a pained sob. "I worked so," he coughed again, his body beginning to fade into motes of light, "worked so hard to give you that perfect moment. Before death," he sniffled. I needed to do that. So you would forgive me." "Oh, Sanson," she giggled and held him out in front of her. "You really are a pitiful, adorable person." She gave him a small smile. "From the start, I never had any grudge against you." He stared at her with wide eyes, tears trailing down his cheeks. "You never needed my forgiveness in the first place." "Oh," Sanson released a small sigh, slumping his remaining arm and released a hollow laugh as he fell into Marie's shoulder. "I see. Go on now. You can take a nice little nap here." Marie cooed, his form already was half gone. "Maybe we'll meet each other again." "That doesn't sound too," he didn't finish as he vanished in a golden shower of light, leaving Marie alone in the field of destruction. She sighed and shook her head and released a small laugh. "Honestly, why'd I get all the troublesome ones?" she asked herself as she stood up. "Sigward and Farum Pav. Excellent." Farum shouted as his spear smashed into Sigward's greatsword, the Onion Knight's knees buckling under the strength of the strike. "Your skills. Your strength. The stories of the Knights of Katarina hold weight after all." Stormruler released a burst of wind. While having no effect on Farum, it did serve to kick up enough debris to allow Sigward to dash away from underneath of the rider's spear, the weapon following through and striking the ground where Sigward had been moments earlier. "Well," Sigward chuckled as he rolled back to his feet, "I would be quite worried if I were to give a poor name to my own kingdom." "Indeed." Farum laughed. This is why I am here." He spread his arms wide. "This feeling, this purpose, bringing so many proud warriors together to fight for a reason of righteousness. The thrill of the battle and the glory one feels as their side takes victory. Is this not what a true war should be? Forgive my rudeness, but I do not see the glory in serving such a woman," Sigward pointed out. Farum stilled and dropped his arms. He stared at Sigward before slowly nodding. "You speak truth. She reminds me too much of my father, so caught up in waging a war out of her hatred. It is blind aggression," he snarled, "barely worthy of my presence." "Then why serve her?" Sigward frowned behind his helm. "If her take on war disappoints you so much." "She reminds me too much of my father." Farum shrugged. "Like I said, she based her conflict solely on hatred. Much like my father. I wanted to know what if he was the exception to wars built on such things becoming nothing more than genocides, or if it was a general consensus." "I see," Sigward nodded his head. "You wanted to know if Lord Gwyn was above such emotions." Farum seemed to recoil in surprise before chuckling. "I see. Archon spoke of my identity before he fought me." He nodded his head. "That is good. And you are not wrong. My father always lorded himself over the pygmies as if they were base animals. He would keep up appearances to their faces, but there was that look of disgust in his eyes whenever he spoke with them, as if he were there better. You disagreed? I cared not. Farum scoffed. Provided one could fight and prove their worth with arms, that was all I needed to determine worth. The dragon witch's hatred of France and my father's hatred of the dragons. Both brought about such needless violence. So it is not my own righteousness I am here to witness. His head traveled to the center of the field. It is your master. You seek to test his worth then? Farum nodded and turned his head back to Sigward. From what I understand, servants are simple weapons. Therefore, should he prevail here and defeat myself and the false saint, then he shall be worthy in my eyes. I suppose that is a fair judgment. Sigward nodded. I suppose we best get back to fighting then? Indeed. Farum nodded. We have remained idle too long. He gripped his spear with two hands and swung forwards, releasing a large wave of dirt and debris which obscured him from the Onion Knight's sight. Sigward tensed, preparing himself for an attack from any angle. Even through the cloud of dirt, he saw a shadow pass above his head. The helmet shot upwards just in time to see the spear tip of Ryder's weapon rocket towards him. Sigward leapt back as it made impact and rushed forwards to strike. Only to falter when the dirt cleared to reveal it was only the spear which had hit the ground. A fake. Sigward shouted in his head in alarm and spun around when he felt a presence creeping up behind him. Sigward swung his blade to strike out to his back only to be blasted away when Ryder delivered a savage haymaker to the side of his helmet. Sigward rolled across the ground, creating a long groove through the dirt, barely able to right himself before he was on the receiving end of another strike from Ryder's spear. Sigward grunted as Stormruler barely blocked the strike before Farum struck out with a kick and knocked him away again. Farum rushed forwards, seemingly taking advantage of the movement when Sigward thrust his sword forwards. A veritable cannon of air being released from the blade, except it wasn't aimed at Ryder. It was instead aimed at the ground he was standing on. The explosion of dirt knocked Ryder into the air. The servant narrowed his eyes and lashed out with his free arm, throwing a spear of sunlight at Sigward. The Onion Knight released a cry of exertion as he released another cannon of wind from his blade, blasting the spear back in the direction of Ryder. Farum widened his eyes in shock and batted away the returning miracle as he fell back to the ground. Using my own miracles against me? You cannot harm me with the wind, so seek to use it to your advantage. He mused, a wide smile birthing itself behind his scarf. Marvelous. He jumped away when another high-pressure attack smashed into the ground in front of him. Sigward jumped towards Farum in the wake of the assault and brought his greatsword down onto the rider. Farum blocked it with the shaft of the spear and forced the saber servant back. He held out his left hand and charged a lightning miracle. Sigward narrowed his eyes behind his helmet as the rider threw the spear into the air. He followed the spear with his eyes, which promptly widened in shock as it split into over a dozen smaller projectiles which rained down upon him. The Onion Knight gripped his sword with two hands and began to encircle the blade with wind. Ha! Sigward released a cry as he swung the blade upwards towards the projectiles. The wave of wind causing many to fly off course of impact the dense portions of the wave and detonate. Continuously firing off wind from your blade to combat my miracles. Farum observed. It appears it was not an isolated incident. Sigward lowered his blade back towards the rider. Astolfo Pav. Guys? Astolfo called out in a slight panic as the dragon continued to chase him through the skies. I am still being chased by a dragon. Send help. Lure the dragon towards myself. He heard Assassin reply immediately. I have an idea. Sure. Astolfo gave an affirmative, then turned around. Follow me, big dumb bird dragon thing. His only reply was a roar and a jet of fire sailing over his head. Assassin Pav Sasaki parried away another strike as sweat began to trickle down his brow. Even with the saber's blinded eye, they were still a formidable opponent for him to face. He lashed out with several quick thrusts aimed at the head, body and arms. Saber responded with immediately and blocked most of the strikes. However, his blade struck true in puncturing the shoulder on the blind side of his opponent. Grr! Dian released a grunt of pain as the blade entered and was quickly pulled out, their body reacting immediately and jerking backwards. Sasaki took advantage of this reaction and lashed out again, swiping at the knees of his opponent. Saber was not quite distracted enough to miss the obvious attack, and thrust their sword downwards to block the strike. Sasaki widened his eyes and leant to the side, and Dian swung their rapier upwards in a vertical slash at him. The assassin winced as he wasn't quite fast enough to stop the tip of the blade from gliding through his clothes and leaving a relatively shallow cut across his chest. He frowned as he backed away and narrowed his eyes at the saber, quickly flicking around the battlefield before falling back to the servant. Allowing yourself to be distracted will only end in your death. Dian chastised with a frown. Your attacks have been fruitful in injuring me, but you will need far more effort in order to put me down. I see. Assassin smiled as he assumed a new stance, his body turned sideways to saber and his blade held in two hands in a stabbing position. In that case, we shall just have to attempt something more effective. HMPH. Saber grunted. A noble phantasm? It will need to be powerful too. Saber trailed off and furrowed their brows in confusion. Yahoo! They widened their eyes in alarm and spun around, only to be met with the talons of a large winged beast gripping onto their body and preventing their arms from moving. Saber released a cry of pain as the claws dug in their back and slammed them into the ground as it dragged them along. Astolfo briefly leaned down, extending their arm to Assassin as he shot past the servant. Kojira held out his own hand and gripped the riders tightly, being lifted off his feet as and swung round onto the back of the hippogriff. The beast continued to drag Dian through the ground, the saber crying out in pain as they struggled to break free from the grip of the mount. Astolfo looked over his shoulder to see the beaked mouth of the dragon open up. The back of its throat began to glow a brilliant orange as smoke began to leak out from its mouth. The boy let out a panicked squeal before jerking the hippogriff to the side. The beast released its grasp on Dian at the same time that Storm unleashed a tsunami of dragon fire towards them. The French saber having barely enough time to reorientate themselves through the air before they were consumed in the inferno. The hippogriff banked right as Storm continued to trail after them, the drake snarling in annoyance as it smashed through the dusty remains of the chevalier and snapped its beak shut. Spreading its wings wide, it abruptly jerked backwards and accelerated into the sky. Astolfo and Sasaki looked towards it as its two pairs of wings pulled back as far as they would go. Realization came to Astolfo moments later. Hippo-kun. Down. He barked out just as Storm snapped their wings forwards. The clap of thunder was accompanied by the sudden explosion of wind being launched towards them. The sudden burst knocked the hippogriff out of the sky. The animal slammed into the ground and sent both Sasaki and Astolfo flying off the mount and slamming into the ground with pained groans. The hippogriff quickly got back to its feet and looked to the sky. The shadow of Storm fell over the trio, the drake glaring down at them as it opened its mouth yet again. An orange blur shot past them, crashing into the side of the dragon's chest and causing it to shudder in the air. Four wings furiously beating as it attempted to right itself. A flash of golden light soon emerged, followed by a cry from another rider. Ha! A cross of light exploded out from the drake's chest as it visibly was blasted from the point of impact, the wound on its body glowing brightly and clearly causing the beast a great deal of pain. The blur dropped down in front of the pair, soon revealing the form of Georgios. The man cast a glance over his shoulder to the two servants. I saw the dragon pass overhead and thought it best to offer my aid as a dragon slayer. That was awesome. Astolfo instantly was in his face, eyes sparkling. You just launched yourself through the air and then boom. Guess it goes to show that riders are just naturally the best class. Georgios blinked at the enthusiasm and sent a questioning glance to Assassin. Kojira gave him a helpless shrug in response. The man shook his head and turned back to Astolfo with a somewhat amused smile. While I applaud your ability to keep this level of enthusiasm during a battle. The smile soon turned into a serious look. I would not celebrate too soon. Turning his head, he pointed his sword in the direction that Storm had fallen. The drake slowly getting back to its feet, even as the wound on its chest was visibly steaming. Despite its obvious severity, it was clear to all that the wound was not fatal to the dragon. I appear to have missed its vital organs. Georgios surmised with a slight frown. That is my fault. I was in such a rush that I wasn't able to deploy my noble phantasm and strike true. I, for one, am quite glad you saved us regardless. Kojira smiled at him before turning to the dragon with a frown. And this might be too big a swallow for me to slay. His frown soon changed into a carefree expression. But that doesn't mean I won't try. After all, how can I resist a swallow that size? Astolfo and Georgios stared at him with equal looks of disbelief before Astolfo spoke up. Are you sure that you didn't write anything to the moon? Because that's some evaporation of reason. Talk right there. He shrugged. And this is coming from me, so it must be crazy. Storm reared their head back, flames leaking from their beaked mouth. Sigward and Farum pawed. Farum widened his eyes in shock and his head darted away from the Katarinen. His link with Storm indicated that his mount had encountered someone who was capable of harming it. Not that alone surprised him, he was already aware of one dragonslayer on the battlefield, but he had thought they would have gone for the witch and her own beast. He frowned, turning his head back to the Katarinen. It would seem that he would need to deal with the knight before moving off to see what his mount had attacked. It seems we shall need to finish this fight between us, Farum stated, his spear charging itself in a golden light as the wind around his feet began to pick up and carry him into the sky. For you, Knight of Katarina, I shall finish you with my ultimate attack. In that case, Sigward replied as the air around his sword began to condense and spin, I shall answer you in kind. Farum thrust his spear into the air as the clouds above began to darken and swirl above him, lightning flickering in between them. This spear is of sunlight itself, he intoned, lightning shooting towards and concentrating on the blade of the sword spear. Sigward rushed forwards at the same time. This sword is of partings. The air of sunlight delivers lightning, a sword of a promise to an old friend. With this thrust, I shall inflict upon thee death. With this strike, the giant will be felled. Now strike, my spear, Farum shouted as he drew back his sword spear, the tip glowing brightly like a second sun. Solis. Howl, my sword. Sigward slid to a halt and thrust his sword forwards. Storm. A flat asta. Ruler. A golden stream of light shot from Ryder's spear as a Sigward slashed his blade upwards, the wind slicing through the air and giving the visual of displacing space itself as the air around the attack became a solidified wall of wind. The two strikes met in a deafening clash as wind struck lightning. The resulting collision formed a tornado of wind and golden streaks of electricity which shot into the sky. The cyclone continued picking up speed as the attacks continued. Ha! Both Farum and Sigward released cries of exertion as the wind began to coalesce in the center of the two strikes before exploding outwards, Sigward receiving the worst of the impact as the stray lightning shot out in all directions, scorching parts of his armor and sending him flying. Farum received a better result, being able to avoid a majority of the stray power. However, he wasn't fast enough to prevent several streams from striking his chest and blasting him back as well. The rider let out a pained grunt as he crashed into the ground and rolled for a few meters before coming to a stop. Sigward let out several coughs on the ground as he rolled over, barely able to drag himself back to his hands and knees. His armor was a mess, sections having been melted as a result of the stray lightning blasts or being blackened. Farum released a cough as he got back to his feet. This is my win, Katarinen, he announced, then blinked as he thought of something. It occurs to me, I never asked your name. The saber released a pained wheezing chuckle, and no. I suppose you didn't. I am Sigward of Katarina. Sigward, Farum nodded, a good name. He walked forwards towards Sigward. I shall remember you as a worthy opponent. Sigward just let out a pained breath as Farum raised his spear into the air to decapitate him. Vive la France! Was an accompanying cry as Farum snapped his head to the left just in time to be smashed in the chest by a glass horse. The impact sending him sprawling across the ground before coming to a stop and groaning in pain. Sir Sigward! Marie cried out. How are you? I find myself considerably better now that you are here. The knight chuckled. I must say, you have wonderful timing. Well. Marie grinned. What type of dashing monarch would I be if I couldn't save a hapless knight? I believe you have the roles confused. Another one? Farum muttered as he got back to his feet. Both Sigward and Marie looked over at him. A large gash present across his chest from the impact? You are? Marie Antoinette. She puffed out her chest and grinned, Queen of France. Farum. He nodded his head, former prince of an Orlando. He blinked at her. You do not strike me as a fighter. Well, she awkwardly scratched the back of her head. I suppose I'm not like yourself or Sir Sigward, but I'm not afraid to fight for what I love. Well then, Farum nodded. I can respect your motives. He went to take a step forwards before his head snapped to the side. It appears she couldn't wait any longer. Sigurd coughed out from the ground. Farum turned back to him. The dragon witch. Seems she has finally arrived with her dragon. He let out a huff of humor. With any luck, she'll die. But that is neither here nor there. He readied his spear. Shall we begin? He took a single step forwards, despite her confidence. Marie could feel the sheer presence that this servant radiated. It made perfect sense to her though. He was technically a god, or an exiled god. Nevertheless, he was a divine spirit in the art of war. She held no illusions about fighting him. Her eyes darted nervously towards Sigurd. The onion-shaped armor was warped and burnt. Several parts along its chestpiece were bent and blackened from his fight, while the god seemed realistically no worse for wear. Even after he took her mount to his chest. I certainly hope you weren't planning on beginning without me, Maria? The group looked around to see Amadeus closing in on them. The musician giving her a disapproving look. It's always like you to rush into things like that, isn't it? Farum stared at him blankly for several seconds before he tilted his head to the side. What are you supposed to be? Me? The man blinked, then bowed. I, my violent fellow, am Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, famous musician. I never cared for songs. I can tell. The man replied. You muscleheads are all the same, with no appreciation for the finer talents beyond simply swinging a sword above your head and cutting down other muscleheads. A scowl came to his face as he threw up his arms. Honestly, the lot of you are of a piece. Farum remained silent for a few moments, then lowered his spear so the tip was pointed towards the caster. The head of the weapon glowed brightly for but a moment before a sudden burst of lightning shot forth towards the caster. The man let out an eep sound and quickly jumped away as the beam struck the ground where he had been stood, releasing a small explosion of lightning which sent him rag-dolling through the air before face-planting the ground. He pushed himself up while spitting out a mouthful of dirt. Don't get angry at me because you can't handle criticism. HMPH. Farum blinked, then looked down at his spear before back at the caster. Oh, it seems my temper got the better of me. I mean to inquire as to whether you were of sound mind, but instead I attempted to kill you for your stupidity in insulting me to my face. He slowly turned this head of the spear so it was facing him again. Allow me to. Guillotine breaker. He jumped back as Marie's glass horse shot past him. He turned to fire on her when he noticed his legs suddenly become stiff. His eyes shot down to see crystals rapidly claiming his body. Spinning his spear, he slammed the tip into the growing crystalline field and released a small explosion at the base of his feet, shooting himself up into the sky with a scowl aimed towards the rider. It was certainly one of the most unorthodox attacks he had seen in a long time. The wisps of blue light fluttered away from the crystals at Sigurd's feet, coming to a rest on his body as he gradually felt his injuries lessen. The Katerianan knight gaped at the healing before a jovial expression came to his face, slowly rising himself up and resting Stormruler on his shoulder. He sent a beaming expression Marie's way. Quite the skill you have there, Lady Marie. Well, she winced. I won't be able to do something like that again, she informed him as her glass horse trotted next to him. Using my noble phantasm twice so quickly has left me a little depleted. Not to worry. Sigurd rolled his shoulders as he stepped forwards. With your support, I believe we have a real chance now. Do you? Of course. Sigurd grinned at her. I am a knight of Katarina. As you are now, you are a damsel in distress. It would be a great insult if I did not play the role of fairy tale knight. Marie let out a melodious laugh in response, shaking her head in amusement at the knight. Yes, I suppose it is like a knight to want to look impressive for a royal. Quite so, Sigurd admitted, gripping his greatsword with both hands. I believe I shall play the role of knight and rescue Sir Wolfgang. Marie giggled. He is looking like quite the damsel right now, she joked, although she was quite worried about him as he continued to try and avoid the god's bursts of lightning being shot at him. Sigurd hunched his body forwards and charged down at Farum. The god stood just at the edge of the field of glass. He snapped his head when he heard the sound of shattering just in time to raise his spear to block Sigurd's slash towards him. The god stared down at him with a brief look of surprise before schooling his features. Farum swung his leg out, catching Sigurd in the side of his chest and sending the knight flying away from him. Sigurd flipped through the air, landing on his feet and stabbing his sword into the ground to anchor himself before looking up towards Farum. The god virtually ignored Amadeus now as he focused his attention on Sigurd. I had not thought you could recover so quickly. You are not a miracle user by chance, are you? I am indeed, but it was not miracles which have gifted me this power. Sigurd responded, rising to his feet and grinning. Farum tilted his head, then stared at the glass field as it receded with a brief flash of understanding. I see. The power to kill one's enemies and heal one's allies. He chuckled, briefly glancing at the pale-haired woman sat atop the glass horse. Perhaps I underestimated her entirely. That has been my blunder so far. He exhaled, slowly turning back to Sigurd. No more. I will face you in the way you fully deserve. Servants versus Storm Pav. A torrent of fire flowed freely from the drake's mouth, accelerating towards the trio. Astolfo let out a panicked squeal and jumped into the air away from the river of flames. Sasaki was far more reserved in his apprehension, the thinning of his lips being the only indication of his anxiety in the face of a dragon breathing fire at him. He imagined that was the usual response, or rather it would be if Georgios hadn't immediately jumped atop his horse and charged straight towards the drake. The torrent of fire seemed to wash over the rider and his mount without causing any harm to them. The drake snarled at their forms emerged undamaged from the flames. As he closed in, the drake snapped its beak shut towards them. Georgios ducked low as the maw of the beast passed over his head. Swinging his sword up, he caught the drake along the cheek with the edge. The sword carved a vicious line along the face of Storm as the drake recoiled from the attack. The large drake beat its wings violently, sending powerful gusts of wind towards the rider as it attempted to take flight once again. Something slammed into its back and exploded, doing little in the way of any real harm but was enough for the drake to jolt in surprise. Georgios blinked in shock before turning his head just in time to see a man in silver armor towards the front of the French lines pointing in the direction of the drake, the soldiers behind him clearly preparing another volley of cannon fire. Reload! Giles shouted out to his troops behind him. The drake turned his head towards their front lines and narrowed his eyes towards the cannons. Quickly, ground the beast before it is upon us. The drake shot off the ground. The sudden explosion of wind as it launched itself into the air had Georgios cover his eyes as dirt blasted itself into his face. He cleared away his eyes before noticing the drake flying skyward. His eyes soon widened in alarm as they fell back on the French lines. Go, Bayard! He commanded his horse as it broke into a gallop. The rider looked over his shoulder and up to see if he could spot the drake. Barely catching sight of it as it disappeared into the cloud layer above them. He mentally cursed as he urged his mount to accelerate faster. Come on, assassin! Astolfo called out to the man as he made a break for his hippogriff, the mount shaking itself to remove the dirt from its feathers before looking over to the pair of servants moving towards them. We're gonna have to get airborne. Always wanted to chase a dragon, never saw myself doing it though. And how does it live up to your flight of fancy? Sasaki asked with a raised eyebrow as he climbed atop the back of the creature. Astolfo jumped onto the creature and then gave Assassin a beaming smile. It's just as terrifying as I imagined it would be. I'm glad you are finding ways to enjoy yourself. The rider gave a mad laugh in response as the hippogriff took off into the air, shooting into the sky at breakneck speeds in the direction that the dragon had disappeared off to. Georgios kept his eye on the sky, even as he approached the front lines of the French soldiers. The troops already attempting to protect themselves from the undead and wyverns that now assailed them. Although the true threat at this stage was the dragon which the god called his mount. No, Georgios knew dragons. That beast was certainly fierce, but it wasn't a full dragon. It was certainly far more powerful than a wyvern, that much was obvious, but to be compared to a full dragon the likes of Fafnir wasn't right. He dismissed the thoughts from his head, right now they weren't important. Bayard dispersed as he launched himself towards the nearest wyvern. Ascalon arced through their air as it split the lizard in half, the two parts falling to the ground in front of the man it had been attacking. The man in silver armor looked down at the animal at his feet with wide eyes before looking up, quickly schooling his expression and offering a quick nod of his head. My thanks, monsieur. If only all our foes would fall as easily. You must withdraw as far as you can. Georgios pleaded with him, sending another glance to the eerily quiet sky. If the drake comes back. I am no fool, monsieur. He grimaced. I know that as mere men, We cannot hope to stand against such things. But this is a battle we cannot retreat from. His eyes turned away from Georgios and further across the field. A desperate gleam entered them. There is someone I have to see. No. I could never live with myself if I failed her now. Georgios recognized the fanatic loyalty of the man before him. He pursed his lips but eventually nodded. Then I ask that you keep back and allow me to deal with the drake. I am afraid that it is beyond you. The fact it withstood direct cannon fire clued me into that unfortunate issue. Despite the situation, he gave a minor chuckle. But yes, we will be sure to keep out of your way. My thanks, good sir. Georgios nodded to him, giving a pleased smile. I wish you luck. I as well. Might I ask the name of the man who will do France this courtesy? Of course, you may call me Georgios. The man chuckled. The name of the dragon-slaying saint? I suppose it is fitting. He extended a hand to him. It would be rude not to share my name with such a man. I am Gilles de Rais, Marshal of the French army. Georgios' eyebrows climbed up his brow in response. You. A loud roar cut off what he was about to say next. The pair snapped their heads to the sky. The light of the sun shining in their faces and causing them to raise their hands to cover their eyes. Georgios squinted his eyes as he looked to the sun. The surface of the yellow ball seemed to have a black dot shooting across it, which was rapidly growing larger and more distinct. Realization set in immediately. Georgios turned to Gilles in a panic. Get your men to fall back now. Gilles understood as well. The man gave a quick nod and turned to his troops, rapidly shouting for them to make a retreat. Storm accelerated towards the ground, wings tucked in to fully maximize its speed. Moving at blurring speeds, the drake spread its four wings wide as its shadow fell across the lines of the French troops. Its mouth opened wide and spewed for a river of fire, glassing the surface of the earth and burning all below it as it passed above the army. Men and ghouls alike caught in the flames were reduced to ash. The drake used the speed in its dive to turn upwards, beating its wings heavily as it went for another pass. Run! Gilles' shout echoed across the field as he pointed further. Find cover. Not that they needed much incentive. The French army began to break into a frantic dash in all directions as Storm passed overhead. The stream of fire passed through another section of the army. The screams of burning comrades only seemed to fuel the retreating French into run faster and harder. Georgios rode through the burning field as he followed after the wake of the drake's attacks, his face set in a stern frown. Storm released another roar as it made another turn through the sky. The large drake made for another pass as it focused towards the bulk of the retreating French troops. Gilles span around as he heard the roar, looking skyward to see the drake accelerating towards him and the rest of the troops. His heart dropped into his stomach as he watched the beast's mouth open up and the glowing of the back of its throat heralded by the torrent of dark smoke which began to leak out from its maw. Despite all the madness, and his impending death, Gilles could swear for a moment he heard the cry of an eagle across the sky. Of course, when something blurred through the sky and slammed into the head of the drake, violently knocking it off course and then clung to its head, he was left equally dumbfounded at this sudden miracle. He squinted his eyes to get a better look as the drake floundered through the air, desperate to shake loose whatever was clinging to it. He had no idea what manner of beast it was, but right now he didn't care. It had distracted the drake and prevented the death of more of his men. That was enough for him. Get him, Hippo-kun! Astolfo cried out as he thrust his lance towards Storm's head repeatedly, puncturing small wounds in its tough hide. His hippogriff slashed and bit at the head of the drake as it clung onto its neck for dear life. The way in which Storm was flying through the air, it was as well have been. The drake let out another enraged roar as it began to swing its head from side to side as it flew through the air. That only served to encourage the hippogriff to sink its talons into his skin deeper, drawing trace amounts of blood from the drake's neck. Storm made a sudden turn upwards which had Astolfo cling to the back of the hippogriff with an alarmed expression. One hand was tightly gripped around the fur at the hippogriff's neck, the other was tightly holding onto Assassin. The man had foregone his usual serene expression as was looking somewhat panicked as the only thing stopping him from falling hundreds of feet through the air was the rider's grip. As Storm climbed higher and higher into the sky, the hippogriff found it exceedingly more difficult to keep its claws in the drake's neck. Astolfo looked over his shoulder to see the ground gradually falling away from them before, for a brief moment, a sane thought came to his mind. Let go Hippo-kun! Astolfo ordered. The hippogriff obeyed immediately, releasing its hold on the drake and falling backwards. Astolfo pulled Sasaki closer to him and gripped the man tightly to ensure he didn't fall off. Hold on. To what, exactly? The hippogriff pulled into a dive, tucking its wings closer to its body as it shot towards the ground as fast as it could. Storm spread his wings wide and turned around to face the falling group before he performed a similar stunt. The arrow-shaped blurs of the hippogriff and Storm soon broke through the cloud layer, rapidly falling towards the ground. Astolfo scanned through the ground before locking onto something. He pulled the hippogriff towards the right and changed the direction of their fall, now turning it into a targeted dive in the direction of something. Storm kept with them, banking its body to follow them step for step as it fell to the ground. Its mouth slowly opened up as the sputters of flame began to emerge from the back of its throat. Black smoke leaked from the maw and trailed behind it in a disturbing streak of darkness which made the drake look more like a menacing dark comet than of the dragon kind. Astolfo squinted his eyes as the wind buffeted against his face. He risked another look over his shoulder towards the drake, who was getting far too close to comfort. "I hope you have a plan," Sasaki shouted out over the wind, his voice tinged with a slight degree of nervousness. "Of course I don't," Astolfo shouted back, completely devoid of worry. "I have a hunch. Forgive me if I'm not reassured." "Ha ha ha ha." The rider gave one last amused laugh before he roughly pulled on the hippogriff. The mount jerked upwards just before it hit the ground and shot across the field horizontally. Storm followed after them, its tail just slamming into the ground and carving up a section of dirt as it changed direction. "Almost," Astolfo muttered. "Almost there." He bit his lip as Storm closed in on them, maw opening as wide as it could. "Rider!" Sasaki gave his first, slightly panicked shout as the first sputters of fire nipped at their backsides. "Now Hippo-kun." The hippogriff abruptly banked left, revealing the target Astolfo had been shooting towards. Georgios stood in the field, Ascalon extended towards the drake as it shot towards him. Its eyes widened in sudden concern as it spread its wings out to try and slow its charge. Its large size made that impossible as the rider launched himself forwards, blade glowing with brilliant golden light as he thrust it towards the drake's head. "Ascalon." The man slashed a cross of burning light directly in front of the drake and then thrust the sword through the center of the shape. The light exploded outwards, consuming the drake's head and sending it sprawling over him, crashing into the ground in a heavy thud which upturned the earth and sent a cloud of debris into the air. Georgios covered his face as the dirt slowly began to rain down on them. The cloud of dust cleared to reveal Storm. The drake with a large burning hole running through its head, eyes glazed over and lying limply on its back. Its body slowly began to dissipate into motes of golden light. Georgios watched it disappear before offering it a slightly respectful bow. "I hope you find peace in the next life, Drake." He prayed before raising his head and turning to see Astolfo and Sasaki land near him. The pink-haired rider gave him a large thumbs up. "Nice work," knew that everything would go according to plan. "I thought you said you didn't have a plan?" Sasaki dryly asked from behind the rider. Astolfo knocked his knuckles against his forehead and made a "tee" noise in response, earning a sigh from both Sasaki and Georgios. A bolt of lighting shot skyward in the distance, earning their attention. "That must be the rider of the dragon mount." Georgios frowned. "I fear that they may require help in dealing with them." "Yeah. Just beat a dragon." Astolfo chuckled nervously. "Who says we can't beat a god?" Servants versus Ferrum Pav. Ferrum stomped down on Stormruler, pinning it to the ground before swinging his leg upwards and catching Sigward in the chest. The knight let out a pained cough as the kick sent him skywards. The rider span around, leveling his spear towards Marie and charging it with lightning. The tip glowed a bright gold before it exploded forth in a burst of lighting. The ring on the woman's finger glowed as she swept her hand to the side, releasing a wave of glass roses towards the beam of lighting. It did little to stop the attack, but did delay it long enough for her to leap clear of the blast zone. Ferrum changed his spear's direction to track her when he abruptly froze. His eyes widened and his head snapped away from them and towards the battlefield. He remained silent for a few moments before he gently whispered out, "Farewell, old friend. I'm sorry I wasn't there." He inhaled and turned his attention back to the three servants in front of him. "It seems as though it is just me, although I have no doubt she will take to the field soon." "The Dragon Witch." Amadeus guessed as he flourished his conductor's baton. Farum spared him barely a glance before he nodded his head. I suppose we shouldn't dawdle. His spear twirled in his hands before he planted it in the ground. I can sense your reinforcements closing in. You're going to wait? Marie blinked at him incredulously, then tilted her head to the side. Why? 3 or 6 servants make no difference to me. Farum replied. Besides, despite your courage, you are not warriors. So it is better for me to await more capable foes. I'm not going to complain about it. Amadeus shrugged in response, earning a roll of the eyes from Marie. What? He's practically giving us better odds. In much the same way that a toddler has better odds at fighting a dog than a newborn. Farum responded, casting his eyesight away from the trio and towards the group flying towards him. Astolfo and Sasaki visible atop the hippogriff while Georgios rode Bayard on the ground below them. Well. Farum grunted, grabbing the handle of his spear and ripping it free from the ground, looking back at the group. Shall we resume our battle? Rewrite of the original chapter because it felt more fitting to have Georgios kill them. So there's that. Anyway, the Omake. Dress-up fiasco. I'd like to thank everyone for showing up at rather short notice. Ritsuka stated as he entered the conference room. As I'm sure you've all noticed, there is a common theme between all of you. He gestured around the room. The gathered servants all looked between each other before they stared back at Ritsuka. Some were curious. Most were bored. 1 or 2 were annoyed. Ritsuka's face turned grave. This is a serious issue which faces you all. He narrowed his eyes. Once or twice could be ignored. But as it stands, I can no longer allow it to continue. Is there an issue, my lord? Verndari, aka the Looking Glass Knight, asked with a raised hand. You're damn right there is. Ritsuka shouted and slammed his hands on the podium. Not a single one of you has changed their outfit when being ascended. The opportunity to see a servant wearing a different suit of armor, or a different dress is half the reason I do it in the first place. He threw his arms up. So how come none of you actually changed their armor? Are you trying to make a joke at my expense? Seath growled out. Ritsuka turned to him and then blinked. He cringed when he realized that the dragon caster couldn't actually do anything to alter his appearance. And was still very, very bitter about not having scales. No, Ritsuka raised his hands in a placating manner. In fact, I'm not quite sure why you're here in the first place. Priscilla was invited. He answered immediately. Then his eyes seemed to narrow. Do you have an issue with how my daughter dresses? Father, Priscilla whispered from her spot beside him. Try not to make a scene. He's insulting your robes, dear? Seath seemed to frown and cross his arms. That is an insult I cannot let stand. How come Gwendolyn isn't here? Farum asked with a raised hand. He still goes about Chaldea in his dress. Yes, but the summer event gave him a swimsuit. Ritsuka replied immediately, although some of our more self-conscious female servants said we aren't allowed to put him in a school swimsuit again. I thought it looked nice. Aldrich chimed in. Made him look very delectable. Oh great, here we go. Sully Vaughn sighed out loud and palmed his face as Farum's head slowly turned to Lord of Cinder. What was that you said? Kerr. What? Aldrich chuckled. I was merely complimenting your brother's figure. Lord Farum. Solaire stood up and placed his hand on the rider's arm to stop him when he advanced. This is not the time or place to settle old vendettas. Summoner. Sully Vaughn stood up. Is this meeting truly necessary? Does it matter what we wear? It's about appearances. Ritsuka proclaimed. How can we claim to be able to save humanity when we're still wearing the armor we arrived in? Where is the upgrade? What of the Lancer Artorias? Sully Vaughn asked. I would hardly consider that an upgrade. I would. Artorias muttered under his breath. Ornstein smacked the knight over the back of the head while Kieran glared at him from behind her mask. A few murmurs of agreement swept across the room. A large figure stood up and made their way to the door. Nito? Where are you going? Ritsuka called out. We haven't finished our discussion yet? The large skeleton cloaked in black shadows slowly turned back to the master. It's nearly 7 p.m. I promised to meet Ereshkigal for tea. Apparently that was all that needed to be said as he disappeared out of the room. Can he even drink tea? Verndari asked. He received a few puzzled looks and even more thoughtful ones. Perhaps it is the gesture that counts? Asked Ermengild, aka the Ivory King, although I myself am more curious as to how they met. They are both Lord of the Dead, Raim said as he continued to pet the head of Sif. Perhaps that is how they became acquainted. He does not seem a particularly good conversationalist though. Guy. Ritska shouted. We've gone off topic. We're here to talk about why none of you change your outfits. Should we dye Sif a different color then? Artorias asked, perhaps a pink color? The gray wolf tilted its head and stared at its master with something akin to betrayal and worry. I joke, Sif. Artorias chuckled. I would never dream of dirtying your fur like that. Is there an issue with our current garments? Suli Von asked. That is a practical answer. He cut off Ritska when he went to say something in response to that. Look. Ritska sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. I'm trying to bring a bit of good change to Chaldea. If you want good change, why not feed these two to one of the smaller servants? Ferrum scoffed while gesturing to Suli Von and Aldrich. It would at least put their pathetic lives to use. Perhaps Lord Ferrum is simply vexed that I ensured he no longer had a family to betray. The false pontiff shot back. There was a tense silence between the two as those around them began to back up slightly. And now guys, Ritska tried to settle everyone down as he could see where this was heading. Let's return to. I'll return him to the fucking grave. Ferrum shouted out, then launched himself at Suli Von. He knocked Velstad onto Priscilla as he tackled Suli Von to the floor and began trying to throttle him. The large knight barely stopped himself from flattening the crossbreed. Are you unharmed, Mila? Trying to molest my daughter, are you? Was Sif's loud accusation, which was quickly followed by the royal aegis being flung across the room by a backhand and onto Gundyr. The champion, who had fallen asleep, was immediately jolted awake by the perceived attack and responded accordingly. By punching the wrong person in the face. Ermengild was knocked to the floor by the punch of the champion. However, he swept the lancer's legs out from underneath him and sent him crashing to the floor. Ritska could only watch helplessly as the room descended into a mad free-for-all brawl between all of his servants. He looked to his left to see the ever-silent Darklurker simply floating next to him as it seemed to observe what was occurring as well. I don't suppose you would be interested in a costume change, would you? Ritska hazarded a guess. The angel-looking caster turned its darkened hood to him, then shook its head. Ritska gave a disappointed sigh and turned back to the brawl. He could always stop them all with a command seal. Abyss Watchers, combine into Ember Watcher, was the declaration that the pointed-hatted knights shouted out before they all rushed into a single being, which looked exactly the same. He looked back to the two that had started this. Ornstein had Suli Von restrained while Ferrum was continually punching him in the gut. The biggest surprise to him, however, was the Firekeeper. The ordinarily kind-hearted caster was currently displaying previously unseen feats of strength. By punching Kieran in the throat, I just wanted them to have new outfits, Rasuka moped. Dark Lurker pat him on the shoulder. Chapter 18. Showdown. Jalter's head snapped to the side in alarm as several wyverns were shot out of the sky by cannon fire. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Ritska and his group were similarly surprised until Jean spun around and shouted in both surprise and elation. Giles. Ritska spun around as well to see the French army charging downhill towards the wyverns, a man in silver armor leading the charge, shouting at the top of his lungs. Fight. We fight for the survival of France. The field marshal exclaimed, sword held aloft. Cannons. Fire on the dragons. Fire everything we have, men of France. Fight with all your will. Fight for the future of France. For the saint who stands at our side. Utter trash. Jalter snarled. Fafnir. She stood on the dragon's neck before leaping off. Kill these fools. She slammed into the ground and leveled a glare at Jean. I'm going to settle right now, once and for all, if your petty little ideals can withstand the full force of my vengeance. Jean remained steadfast at her double's declaration. I too will show you the difference between us. If my words will no longer reach you, then I am forced to utilize less than civil. Shut the fuck up and fight, peasant bitch. Jalter shouted and charged forwards. The two servants collided in an explosion of force. Jalter proving the stronger by bodily slamming Jean into the ground before delivering a kick to her gut which knocked her away. Fafnir reared his head back and released an ear-splitting roar. forcing Ritska to slam his hands around the side of his head in a vain attempt to prevent any damage. Siegfried! He shouted, his face contorted in pain. Kiyohime's eyes narrowed at the dragon, a snarl making its way onto her face. Of course, master. The knight stepped forwards, sword gripped in two hands. Fafnir ceased his cry and lowered his head towards the knight, eyes burning with recognition and hatred, a foul black steam pouring from his mouth and nose as it stared down at the Netherlands prince. To think we'd meet a third time, Fafnir. He lamented, perhaps in another life, we would have a better connection than this. His face hardened. But it matters not, here and now, wicked dragon, I shall strike you down. See you, Chalain Pav, son of a bitch, Lancer cried as he parried yet another strike. You know, most people die when a spear pierces through their heart. Gale remained silent as he continued to hack away at his opponent's defense. The fist-sized hole in his chest where his heart would be evidently did little to hinder his movements in the least, much to Lancer's irritation. This is why I have fighting undead ghouls and shit. See you, snarled, spinning his spear and parrying away a strike aimed at running him through before he thrust his spear forwards. Gale's hood snapped to the side as the spear sailed just past and sliced off a small part of the red cloth covering his head. A giant fist lashed out as the giant stumbled forwards. Lancer curved his body as best he could as the fist sailed past, barely grazing his torso. He kicked back as Gale changed his punch to a backhand, the force behind the wipe being powerful enough to visibly move the air and send up a small cloud of dust. The berserker followed through with the punch and changed it into a thrust towards Lancer. The blue-haired servant let out a small cry as the rusted blade just slipped past his guard and slashed at his side. Not enough to immobilize him, but enough to sting. Lancer grit his teeth and struck back. Gale's head snapped to the side as a roundhouse kick from Lancer smashed into the side of his head, the heel of his steel boot striking the berserker servant's jaw and causing a loud snap sound to follow. Gale released a wheeze as he stumbled slightly. Lancer was quick to follow through with another thrust, the spear tip punching straight through Gale's chest. Lancer ripped the spear clean when the gauntlet reached forth to crush his skull. At this point Lancer was exasperated. This is getting fucking stupid now. Lancer gripped. You've got no heart and there's a hole in your chest. He twirled the spear as Gale shifted, ready to pounce like an animal. Just die already. Gale released a cry as he leapt forth, law, and was promptly sent flying when a rather powerful blast smashed into his side. Lancer winced, not because of the strike itself, but because that was the worst noise he'd ever heard in his life. What in the— He looked to the right to see the dragon girl, Elizabeth if he recalled correctly, strutting forth with a smug grin on her face. The hell are you doing here? I thought you were after that crazy chick? HMPH. Elizabeth huffed, as if she was a match for an idol like myself. You should be grateful, little pig, that I decided to lend you my aid and allow you the honor of hearing my voice. That was your singing? Lancer asked. At her nod he cringed and looked over to the old man, getting back to his feet after the blast. He sent him a silent thought of condolence for being on the receiving end of that. Well? Elizabeth asked. Where is my gratitude for saving you, piggy? He's still alive, you know. Lancer scoffed. I hope you're a better fighter than you are singer. Well, Wait. What's that supposed to mean, Ash Pav? The undead saber snarled behind his helmet as his sword, once again, passed through mist as the berserk Lancer rendered his body immaterial and floated around him. Ash spun around to block the lance that was swung at his back as the servant rematerialized. The ground beneath his legs cracked as the full force of the strike went right through him. Ash winced. This servant had him beat in strength and his ability to turn his body into mist was troubling. He was not without power to harm the servant, however. His sword burst into life with flames. The sudden heat caused Lancer to hiss, his grip slacking and allowing Ash to shunt the spear to the side and punch forward with his left hand. The outstretched palm struck the Lancer in the chest. The Lancer servant grunted. The power behind the blow was certainly strong but not enough to floor him. Ash wasn't aiming at striking him down with a punch, however. He smirked behind his helmet as the palm lit up in black flames and blasted outwards. Lancer let out a cry of alarm as black flames lashed out at his body, the combustion blasting him away. Ash wasn't able to advance as the berserk Lancer's hand flashed outwards, hand outstretched as if casting something. For a few moments nothing happened. Then the ground beneath Ash sprung to life. Stakes burst from the ground aiming to impale the servant. Saber widened his eyes in alarm and rolled away from the stream of stakes. He flung a fire orb at them as they changed direction, the stakes being incinerated. He winced as he felt a pain flash up through his legs. He looked down at his kneeling leg to see that several stakes had driven themselves through his shin. He reached down to rip his leg free when his instincts flared to light. Spinning around to the front, he was barely able to get his sword up in time to block the strike from the lancer servant, his face a rictus of anger as the spear smashed into the sword. His entire might behind the strike. Ash was blasted free from his imprisonment and nearly a dozen feet into the air, the wind being knocked out of him as he sailed through the sky. Still in the air, a flash of inspiration came to him. Gripping his sword in two hands and holding it above his head, he released a jet of flame from the blade, the sudden stream of fire creating a jet engine for the servant to accelerate forth, the sped towards the stunned lancer. The berserk servant was just barely able to return to his senses before Ash impacted him, the blade swinging down in a blur of black fire and slashing the lancer's right arm free from his body. The berserk servant let out a cry of pain before kicking Ash in the face, the saber servant being knocked away as Lancer's left arm gripped the stump of his right. Eyes wide and frantic, the lancer servant reached out with his left arm and picked his spear off the ground. Ash, meanwhile, got back to his feet. He needed a move to surprise the enemy servant. He could think of one for that moment. Holding out his left hand, he charged up a pyromancy and slammed it into his own chest. An ember-like burning spread across his body as he charged forth. Lancer prepared his stance, confident that even with his missing limb, he was still strong enough to block the saber servant. Which is why he was left stunned when Ash swung his blade up in an uppercut-like fashion, with strength that exceeded his own. Lancer's guard was completely obliterated in a single strike. Ash charged up a chaos pyromancy in his left hand, the gauntlet being coated in fire, and he punched forth. Lancer, releasing what was about to happen, went to turn to mist. Far too late. With a roar, Ash drove his fist straight through Lancer's chest. The metal glove coated in fire burst through the back of the servant. Lancer vomited up a bloodied substance from his body as the burning spread across him. The pair stayed motionless for a few moments before Ash ripped his fist free. Lancer stumbled as the arm was pulled from his chest, the giant hole in the center of his torso having been cauterized by chaos flames as Ash had punched through him. Without saying a word, Berserk Lancer turned to Ash, his face remaining blank despite the obvious pain he was in. He nodded once before collapsing to the ground, body dissipating into motes of golden light. Lancer is dead. Is anyone in need of aid? Ash sent out a telepathic call. For a few seconds there was silence. Then he received his answers. Enemy rider is kicking our collective asses. Astolfo called back, slightly panicked. I'll be there momentarily. He bit his lip and turned in the direction of the conflict. He let out a breath and began running. Servants versus Ferrum. The sound of clashing steel was quickly followed by grunts of pain. Ferrum twirled his spear, the weapon blurring as it blocked the mana projectiles from Marie. He span of his heel and threw a bolt of lightning. Georgios widened his eyes and rolled to the side, the bolt of sunlight striking the ground next to him and causing a small explosion which sent him tumbling away. Turning on his heel again, he blocked the strike from the still injured Sigward before delivering a kick to his chest. Armor bent inwards due to the force and sent the Katarinen spinning through the air before smashing into the ground, creating a small crater. Ferrum had barely a moment to compose himself before he was blocking another wave of projectiles from the musician. He would admit to being beyond perplexed as to what a song master was doing here. However, the man was evidently willing to fight, so who was Ferrum to deny him? It was only when one of the pink blasts went past his guard and struck him did he realize just how outclassed the musician really was, the pink blast dissipating before it even reached him. There was a brief silence between the two. Ferrum staring at the man in an incredulous fashion and Amadeus cringing at how ineffective he was. I assume you have more to grh, he grunted and span around, Georgios having delivered a slash to the back of his leg. Ferrum struck out with the butt of his spear, nailing the rider in the temple and sending him to the ground. Ferrum moved to crush his skull under boot before he found himself being tackled by the pink rider's beast. Spear blown from his hand, Ferrum was forced to wrestle with the beast. Gripping each of its claws with his hands, his head was left vulnerable as the animal tried to peck at his face. "Yeah," Astolfo cried out. "Kick his ass, Hippo-kun." "Admirable." Ferrum spoke, but not enough. The hippogriff widened its eyes in alarm as Ferrum lifted the creature off the ground before bodily slamming it. He delivered a savage punch to the side of its head as it attempted to get up. He span around as Marie closed in on him, riding atop her glass horse. Performing a 180 spin, he avoided the attack and lashed out with the back of his arm, clotheslining the girl from her ride and sending her crashing to the ground. "Surely you did not expect for me to fall for the same attack twice?" he scoffed. "I would hope you would not underestimate me to such an extent." Requiem for death. Ferrum widened his eyes in alarm as musical notes surrounded him. Seconds later he felt his entire body shake with agony as the music began to assault his very being. He collapsed onto one knee as he felt his strength leave his body. "A curse," he spat out, then realized his magic resistance was working overtime to prevent further damage. He narrowed his eyes. His strength and speed had been reduced, but not as severely as they could have been. He was still superior to them. His head snapped to the musician. If he died, then perhaps his noble phantasm would cease. He had no way of knowing, but it was his only chance. Manifesting his sword spear, Ferrum leapt into the sky and above the musician. Mozart had barely enough time to kick himself away before the rider smashed into the ground where he had once stood, still in the air and incapable of maneuvering himself. He was unable to do much to prevent the fist the size of his head from smashing into his ribs. Mozart coughed up blood, the impact creating a small shockwave as the caster was blasted into the air. Ferrum charged up his spear, preparing to shoot caster out of the sky. Trap of Argalia, and suddenly found his leg missing, his eyes widening in alarm and surprise as his spear fired off into the air as he lost all semblance of balance. Ferrum collapsed to the floor, his eyes trailing down to see his leg missing. He narrowed his eyes. No. It was simply in spirit form. He snarled behind his scarf, eyes darting around until he locked onto the pink-haired rider. Astolfo chuckled and gave a nervous wave, before he let out a squeal of alarm and jumped to the side to avoid the spear which Ferrum had physically thrown at him. Sasaki was quick to attempt to take advantage of the seemingly disabled rider and moved in to strike the downed servant. Rider's attention snapped to him, his reduced speed being barely enough to avoid the first strike, the second strike slicing across his cheek. Ferrum narrowed his eyes. When Sasaki went for a thrust, Rider lashed out with his palm. He winced as the blade went straight through his hand before stopping just shy of his face. Assassin eyes went wide with surprise. Rider quickly taking advantage of the lapse in judgment to form his hand into a fist. He jerked his pierced hand to the side, snapping the nodashi of the assassin and lashed out with his right hand, striking Sasaki in the gut and launching him away with half his blade still lodged in Rider's palm. Sitting up as best he could, Ferrum cringed as he ripped the blade from his palm and threw it away. He stared down at his missing limb. Bringing his spear forth, he plunged it into the ground and used it to stand himself up on, precariously balancing himself on one leg and his spear as he beheld the servants, most of whom were getting back to their feet and ready for a renewed offensive. "All of you." The group turned in surprise, Ash stalking forwards with his sword in hand, his voice remarkably emotionless. "Leave. Assist Master against the dragon and the witch and Lancer against Gale." "Are you crazy?" Astolfo shouted. "He just kicked all our asses. You'll be." "Go." Ash spoke again. Ferrum frowned beneath his scarf. Something was different about the saber servant. "Please. I need to do this." "You heard him." Sigurd grunted as he climbed to his feet, Marie rushing over to help him up. "He'll be fine." "But, let's get going." Sigurd shouted, as jovial as he could make himself sound. "I believe we have a dragon and a berserker to kill, do we not?" The collected servants frowned, then shook their heads. "Insane. Utterly insane." Mozart scoffed. "Honestly, meatheads and their pride. We'll see you later then. I believe I owe you a special song for this." "HMPH." Ash grunted. "Perhaps I shall enjoy hearing it." He looked to Sigurd. "With luck, we shall meet again." "I pray to the flames we do." Sigurd nodded. "Let's move." Grunts and a few fleeting looks were given before the servants began to walk away from the pair. The roar of the battlefield dying down as the two stared at each other. "You seem different," Farum spoke, slightly intrigued. You are not facing me out of pride, are you? No, Ash nodded his head. I am not. Then regale me, Ashen One. Farum spoke. For what purpose do you seek to fight me alone? Atonement. For your death. Farum almost choked in surprise. I beg your pardon? Atonement. You regret my death, do you? What possible insanity could have spawned this res? I have been a proud member of the Sunlight Covenant for some time. His response silenced Farum. He remained silent for a few moments before he let out a sigh. You did not know who I was when you traveled to Archdragon Peak, did you? To my shame, I did not, my lord. Farum pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a small chuckle. He killed by my own covenant. Gwyn would have laughed, likely would have rewarded you for it as well. I do not wish a reward for such an action. Ash looked to the side. It was my great shame to do so. Had I known who you truly were. I see. Farum nodded, however, he straightened himself. I will not ask for your reparations. I respect strength, everything else is of little concern. You, a member of my covenant, were strong enough to slay me in my hollowed state. For that, you have my respect. Ash's shoulders sagged. Thank you, my lord. You of course realize that my respect for you will also compel me to fight you at my full power. Indeed. You will most likely die. Perhaps. But I would not be so sure. Ash shrugged. I felled the Lords of Cinder. I assume that gives me more than a fair chance. Farum blinked, then let out a boisterous laugh. Ha 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 ha. Indeed it would. His laughter died down. It would still be wise of you to strike me now, while my leg is still immaterial. I would not seek to strike down my lord in such a weakened state a second time. Ash countered. We shall fight when you can stand on your own 2 feet. Farum grunted in acknowledgement. You truly are an odd undead, and yet you are here, are you not? I am. I do not think you understand. Farum went on. If you felled the Lords of Cinder, then why have you not taken their place? Ash went deathly silent. Farum continued, however. I was not ignorant to the world. I knew of the curse Gwyn inflicted upon it. For you to be here and not there, he closed his eyes and sighed. I see. You do not strike me as a Lord of Hollows. I am not. I reject the flame's existence. I would not usurp it. Ash shook his head. What Uriah wanted of me, it was a perversion. I will not comment on it. Farum replied. I have long since separated myself from Londor. Whatever befell the land in Gwyn's kingdom is of no concern of me. But you have my acknowledgement of what you have done. Gwyn broke the world, you attempted to right it. Whatever the outcome of your decision, I will acknowledge your attempt. My appreciation. Ash nodded, then looked down. How long until your leg has been healed? Not long. Farum nodded. Perhaps a minute. He stopped, eyes going wide and darting off to the sky. I am possible. Ash blinked. My lord. The rider's eyes darted down. Ash almost recoiled by how they looked. Wide, frantic and somewhat panicked. I had not foreseen such an outcome. To think such a thing. He looked back at Ash. It seems as though more than us have breached the barrier between worlds. And I do not recognize what did so. If you survive our fight, I shall entrust you to be prepared to fight it. I will. Ash nodded. Provided we survive, I shall ensure your will is carried out. Do not treat me like Gwyn. Farum shook his head. I was more of a general than a king. As you with then, sir. I believe you have earned the right to use my name. As you wish, Lord Farum. Honestly, Farum let his posture slip. You and Ornstein both. What a pair you are. I shall hope the 3 of us are never in the same room. I'd likely assume my name is Lord by the end of a conversation. He chuckled, an honest laugh, at his own joke. Interlude 1. A lonely hand, it opened its eyes, only dark remained. It looked beyond. Only dark remained. Its mind, ancient and broken, yearned for answers. Only dark remained. A hand reached out to clasp something, not quite there. Only dark remained. 1,000 voices cried out, it heard every single one. An old hand reached out to them, none were right. None were what it was searching for, an ancient desire for something. The broken mind could not recall. It searched for it for so very, very long. That thing, it once held close, closer than anything else, it wasn't there. The broken mind raged. Anger, sadness, guilt, fear, loneliness. The broken mind raged for what it lost. It would keep searching. It would bring it back, it would bring it home. The broken mind would be made whole. It would be made whole. The eyes looked beyond what lay in the dark, beyond what lay in the light. It saw two more like itself, one of pity, one of regression. The one of pity seemed surprised, the one of regression seemed confused. The broken mind was not meant to be. 1,000 fractured thoughts coalesced into a single wish. It would find what it had lost. The one of pity reached out, a message was given. Home. Beyond the reach of dark, beyond the burning of light. The one of pity would guide it to a new place. The broken mind accepted. Time was fractured as the mind moved through it like a shark through water. The ripples expanded outwards and tore across reality. The broken mind landed. A door sealed shut. The broken mind looked beyond. The broken mind reached out in hopes of finding what it lost. It saw. The mind saw a burning. Billions of screams, billions of deaths, a great sadness. It looked beyond. A single point remained. A shining beacon, untouched by the devastation. It looked beyond. The beacon was shielded. Whatever prevented death tried to prevent it from looking beyond. The sight broke through in an instant. The eyes beheld. It found her. So alone. So afraid, trapped, in a glass prison. She hurt. Like it hurt, the broken mind was weak, too weak to save her. It looked back to its place of origin. 1,000 fragmented thoughts unified under a single desire. Free her. 1,000 impulses, 1,000 plans driven towards a single goal. Free her, an entire being, formed in the image of a single desire. A desire to be made whole, a desire to be something more. Hateful, hatred at those who took from it, hatred at those who caused pain to it, hatred of those who used it, hatred of those who denied others. A beast of wrath let loose a shriek. The figure's head snapped up in surprise. A cry was let loose, something breached the border of time and announced its presence to everything that could hear it. Other spirits would be unable to discern what it truly was. Not him. He knew exactly what it was. Oh dear. That is most surprising, he hummed and frowned in thought. He had not expected this development. A smile stretched across what could have been once described as a face. A fitting challenge, perhaps, for the one who seeks the path of a true monarch. The smile fell away when something answered the cry. That was not what he expected. Something replied. He didn't know what it was. Something, older, replied. He looked again. A deep fog slipped through the cracks. He frowned. This was something he had not foreseen. This place would fall before the monarch candidate even knew of its existence. He would be forced to act. The one who had approached him had given him an idea. The Singularities held the solution. It would not prevent the fall of the world, but it would delay it for a good long while. Long enough for the master of humanity to reach it. He chuckled. Who would have thought such trouble would have formed over such a small golden cup? N. First interlude in mystery arrivals. How mysterious, ooh. Also, repeated people asking why I think that the Ashen One was linked to the first flame. Well. They are ash. Ash seeketh embers without the embers, ash becomes cold and inert. Basically, my interpretation was that Ashen Ones are different from regular undead in that they are risen by the first flame itself. If the flame dies, then the ash is left without embers to keep it going. Thus, the ash either becomes inert, i.e. dead, or goes hollow without a purpose. This isn't like other undead, who are naturally occurring, or as natural as you can get in the Dark Souls universe. I could be wrong, but most of the ending for Dark Souls 3 is left ambiguous as to what truly happens in the Let the Flame Die ending. Does the Age of Dark come about, or does the cycle continue? Who knows?